actually intend to talk about the phenomenon of net assessment as much as I do anything else. But here I'd like to say that the basis for what I'm going to be dealing with today has nothing to do with SIGINT. It has to do with the fact that I, as an historian, have written a few things about Russian and British invasions of Afghanistan. And I've spent a lot of time dealing with the issue of ethnocentrism as a factor in the strategy of countries like Britain and the United States, specifically dealing with Japan. Now, I'm going to argue here that the best background to understanding the problems with net assessment in Afghanistan between 2001 and 21 does not lie in looking at, let us say, Russian or British experiences with Afghanistan. It lies in looking at American experiences with problems in counterinsurgency in Indochina. And R. Michael Schaefer wrote a book called Deadly Paradigms, which essentially looked at the intellectual roots for the failure of American counterinsurgency in Vietnam that I think is extremely applicable to what happens in Afghanistan. Now, my argument is going to be that the net assessment level problem that we confronted collectively in our involvement in Afghanistan came in assessing ourselves in a context of net assessment as much as it did assessing foes. In my lifetime of arguing with people like Michael Warner or Michael Handel, they'd often say to me, well, what is net assessment? Is it something intelligence handles? And what we all realize is that, in fact, net assessment is a fractured issue between operations and policy organizations and intelligence agencies. Now, beyond that, I'm going to argue that the problem that underlay net assessment was essentially hidden assumptions, especially ideas which we as liberals make about our own societies and apply to the countries we're involved in when we are conducting counterinsurgency. And the key thing here is that we're not dealing with ideas which are analyzed the way that staff officers will analyze a military issue. These are just assumptions we make about how societies work. And I hope to illustrate that in the next few minutes. Now, I'll talk briefly about why I don't think we can use British and Russian experiences in invading Afghanistan as the key to understanding what goes wrong for us. And that's partly because when the British invade Afghanistan in the first, second, and third Afghanistan wars, and the Russians invade Afghanistan in the late 70s, there is in fact a strategic rationale, however idiotic. The British and Russians convinced themselves that Afghanistan is a potential problem, usually because you view Afghanistan as being a lever to allow radical Islam, or in the case of the British in the 1830s, Russia, to exert their power across the Hindu Kush. And what happens essentially is the British and Russians convince themselves that they're confronting a threat. They also believe they are militarily and, of course, spiritually superior to the people they're going to be dealing with. They invade Afghanistan in order to pursue what in hindsight are fairly chimerical strategic objectives, and they find over time the classic problem with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the easiest country on earth to occupy quickly, but it's also extremely hard to control permanently because it's worthless to anyone who's not an Afghani. Essentially, there is nothing there which is going to be attractive to a government in the long run. And what has happened historically in the modern period is that every attempt to conquer Afghanistan from any neighbor fails in the end because at a certain stage, governments say, this is pointless. Why are we spending money on something that's worthless? They stop spending money, therefore they can't bribe and control Afghanis, and therefore everything collapses. Now, what happens in the American instance is quite different. Because the Taliban allows al-Qaeda to operate from its territory and launch devastating strikes on the United States, the Americans are forced into invading Afghanistan. which, believe me, is not high on their list of strategic objectives, although the Clinton administration in the last few months in office and the Bush administration by about August 2001 are starting to say we're going to have to take active steps militarily in Afghanistan. But there's no desire to actually do it for any reason other than the fact that the Taliban are encouraging terrorism against you. Now, when the Americans invade Afghanistan with the help of special forces from Canada, Australia, the United States, they have overwhelming success. The Taliban collapses, its military forces are annihilated. This confirms the belief which exists in some sectors of the Pentagon about the idea of a revolution in military affairs, which leads you to think that you're even more powerful in the future than you might have just been. And so what happens essentially by the end of 2001 is the Americans, their allies, driven the Taliban temporarily out of the country. They will annihilate an overwhelming proportion of Taliban forces, and then they have no idea what to do. I would argue in hindsight that the only way we could have won the war in Afghanistan is if Osama bin Laden had been killed during the period that we attacked. Because then we could have said, look, we've achieved our end. We killed the guy who killed lots of our people. We can pack up our things and go home. And by the way, little Afghanis, understand that if you screw with us again, you're not going to like the consequences. Instead, the dilemma was that the United States government and NATO more generally kept forces in Afghanistan without any kind of strategic policy, without any attempt to build real public support, which I don't think would have been very easy to do, if at all possible, in Afghanistan, and we simply stayed there for a few years. Now, during that period of time, there was a delusion you would often find in the media that somehow things were working out very well in Afghanistan. I remember whenever I was interviewed by Canadian media saying, look, Karzai is the mayor of Kabul. He has very little control in the countryside. And we, in fact, don't really have much power in Afghanistan at all. Now, that's not a great situation to be in, but then things get worse. When, for reasons of internal American politics, the candidate for the Democratic Party, later President, Barack Obama, decides that he's going to make Afghanistan the thing that will prove that he's not a pacifist, the thing that will prove, in fact, he's competent to be an American leader in hard times. And here, relying on a misinterpretation of how counterinsurgency had worked in Iraq, which was a combination of much more intelligence and rational American use of force, combined with their political ability to exploit a split in the Sunni Muslim community, allowed them temporarily to knock out the Salafi jihadists they were concerned about in Iraq. And from that, the Americans overgeneralized the possibility that counterinsurgency can be conducted in Afghanistan. But on top of that, it's all going to be done in 18 months. We are going to announce that we will build up our forces by 18 months and then we'll build them down, and we'll win. Now, at this stage, the dilemma is that the classic problems of liberal counterinsurgency come to dominate what is happening. This is the first moment that NATO attempts to expand Karzai's hold in Afghanistan. And we do it by trying to do things like create nice government. Because we come from countries where our governments are nice. If governments do something, it might be incompetent, but by and large, we expect to get something from it. The dilemma is that whether it's Vietnam or Afghanistan, it doesn't work that way on the ground. You're dealing with corrupt officials, factionalized government systems, the tendency of everyone to siphon off money for their own purposes. And in essence, we, across Afghanistan, start to make an unpopular government have a much bigger presence in the country. And so, in fact, what we're doing is helping the Taliban come back while we are dealing with an ally who, in fact, is not very popular. These things are actually clear to me and to other analysts, I can say, during this period of time. I'm also not certain that I can point to a better policy, by the way. I'm not convinced that we had a viable strategy ever to win in Afghanistan. Now, beyond that, at the same time, what you see intelligence enabling are some of the most remarkable, focused tactical strikes in history. As an historian of air power, I have to say, I have never seen a campaign based on air power, i.e. UAVs, that inflicted less collateral damage and hit more of its targets than happened in Afghanistan. I am not denying that probably thousands of innocent civilians are killed. I'm just saying that if you put that in historical comparison, it's really a much smaller amount of damage to innocents than usual. And our successes at these tactical issues, I think, lead us to overestimate our ability to achieve strategic results, which in our mind is to create a nice Afghanistan where women's rights will be protected, where people will behave like nice Northern Europeans or North Americans. Our assumption is very, very much based on hubris, that we can make other people behave as nicely as we imagine we are by behaving the way we think they should operate in their territory. So the end result essentially is that by 2016-17, after over 15 years in Afghanistan, after massive allocations of money, the patience of NATO and the United States in particular to go on paying this price starts to wane. And the fact that President Trump and later President Biden both want to simply walk away from Afghanistan by the late teens is a very indicative point. And now I have to say that I imagine that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden didn't realize how quickly things could fall apart if they did what they wanted to do. And that's another indication of the impact of ethnocentrism, I would argue. But in any case, what happens essentially is, finally, at a certain point, the American government decides it will walk away. The NATO component has walked away before this. And we expect somehow that the government will survive for the famous decent interval that Richard Nixon defined for South Vietnam. And in fact, things worked out about as well as they did in the collapse of South Vietnam. I have to say that the way Afghanistan collapsed actually struck me as being a remarkable parallel to what happened in South Vietnam. And to a large degree, the problems are how we conceptualize the way liberal counterinsurgency can work. I have to say that I'm not convinced liberal states can actually conduct counterinsurgency. And they certainly can't do it unless they have a genuine sense that their lives are on the line. And here, what I would emphasize is that the problem, again, stems with how you think about net assessment. To do a net assessment in counterinsurgency means you have to compare societies, something we call willpower, which is a meaningful term, but one that's very hard to define, and compare ourselves to other people. And my own conclusion about the history of counterinsurgency is that the big problems Western countries make are about themselves. And like Socrates and Swanza said, the key thing is to know yourself. And that, I'm afraid, is not something which we have done very well when our countries have conducted counterinsurgency recently. Thank you.